Hello and welcome back to Spectator TV and to the Spectator's COP26 Summit. I'm Kate Andrews, the economics editor here and your host for the next hour as we discuss the psychology behind going green. This panel is kindly sponsored by Smart Energy. So for the next 60 minutes, we're going to focus on what motivates individuals to be green. Is it a sense of moral achievement? Are they following the crowd? Or are they simply trying to save money? Now, Smart Energy has worked with the behavioral architects to study what it is that turns people into those who might want to go green and to take real action on climate change. We'll discuss some of their findings and have a more general discussion on public opinion surrounding green action. Iagan MacNeil is Head of Public Policy and Communications for Smart Energy UK. Bridget Williams is the Research Director at Ipsos MORI on Social Research Institute. Rory Sutherland is the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy Group UK, and they join me now to discuss this extremely important topic. So thanks to the panel for being here with us on Spectator TV today. Each of you are going to give roughly 5 minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll move very quickly to questions. If you sitting at home or in the office would like to submit a question, please do so through Spectator TV. There should be a questions box there. Anything you submit is funneled directly to me, and I'll put as many questions as I can to our panel today. Rory, let's start with you.
Yes, it's a very, very interesting problem. I shouldn't say that because that sounds as if it's a problem that appeals to me for its intrinsic interest rather than being a problem that urgently needs to be solved. And it is, of course, both. What makes it interesting is that there is no absolutely necessary correlation between the generation of energy and the production of atmospheric carbon. There are alternatives. There is wind, obviously, there is nuclear, there is tidal power, geothermal, solar power. And at the same time, it's worth noting that there isn't an absolutely direct correlation between human happiness and well-being and the consumption of energy either. We don't actually derive any pleasure from adding carbon to the atmosphere directly, unless you're a pyromaniac, I suppose. But most people don't actually just enjoy setting fire to hydrocarbons for its own sake. They simply like what energy does for them. Now, what that means is I think there's both good news and bad news. The good news is that there are lots of places you can intervene in order to reduce carbon emissions, both at the level of energy generation and at the level of energy consumption and consumption in general. So in one sense, it's a good thing. The problem is that because there are many, many places you can intervene, it's very easy for this to devolve into what Douglas Adams called a someone else's problem field. Why should I do this? The problem needs to be solved at the level of generation. Or why should I give up doing this? It's really those people over there who need to give up doing that. There are simple behavioral problems. I mean, I grew up in the early 80s when glue sniffing was a problem. I mean, it seems to have gone away. I'm not quite sure why, but you basically either had to stop people selling glue or you had to stop consumers using it. And what you needed to do was fairly clear. Here, there's a whole panoply of different things you can actually adopt in combination, which in one way is good because there's more than one thing you can do. The problem is that everybody can easily offload responsibility onto someone else. And I'm very, very pleased that what we've done here is employ the behavioral architects to do this research, because I think behavioral economics and behavioral science has a very important role to play in that understanding what it is that really motivates the behavior you want to see is really important. And there's a really vital distinction I'd like to make here, which is it doesn't matter if people do the right thing for the wrong reasons, okay? I don't think we should be in the business of intentional purity, where you say the only acceptable reason to cut down on your carbon emissions is basically to save polar bears and to demonstrate your altruism. If people want to cut down on carbon emissions to save money, or they want to do it simply for their love of technology or for aesthetic reasons, let's be absolutely honest, most people who bought a Tesla didn't buy it predominantly to save the environment. They bought it because they thought it was a great car. And my view is that's fine. And so looking at what you can do to create the behaviors you want to see and to look at it from a behavioral lens, not necessarily an intentional lens, I think is a really, really important first step.
Thanks, Rory. Iagan?
Thanks, Kate. Well, yeah, I'm Iagan. We're from Smart Energy GB, and we're the national consumer organisation. And you may have seen some of our adverts around smart meters and encouraging you to adopt a smart meter and adopt the behaviours that come on the back of that. So we've been operating since 2013 to encourage people and to raise awareness around this major upgrade to our energy system. And we're currently, as an organisation, overseeing one of the biggest carbon-saving consumer engagement campaigns of our generation. And so far, we've got about 25 million smart meters installed across Great Britain. And as I've said, the smart meter rollout is a national infrastructure upgrade and much needed modernisation of our energy system. And it ensures that it is fit for the future and able to cope with increasing demand, but also make sure that the energy system is more efficient, to help it reduce carbon emissions, as well as help with the national effort to tackle climate change. And throughout our campaign since 2013, we've been talking about not just smart meters, but also their benefits and what they do to you for you as a consumer, but also what they can do for climate change and the environment as well. And at the heart of our campaign has been consumer insight and research, which helps to inform our campaign and our messaging. Now, we primarily communicate to consumers via mass marketing and communications activity, but we've also had a very strong focus on working in partnership with trusted national, local and hyper-local organisations to make sure that no one is left behind and that everyone in society is able to benefit from smart meters. And our experience is that clear, consistent and concise messaging informed by in-depth behavioural science can help turn those individuals' good environmental intentions into tangible actions. Now, we recently commissioned the Behavioural Architects to conduct some research which updates our current thinking and understanding of the drivers of the intention-action gap for energy efficiency behaviours and the opportunities to minimise that intention-action gap. Now, that research explores how behavioural science can help engage consumers in climate-friendly behaviours and investigates the barriers to undertaking some of those behaviours. It also assesses why good intentions have not yet translated into action. You know, why do people think it sounds like Rory said, buying a Tesla, what are the intentions behind that? But some people might think, I would love to get an EV, but I'm not going to do it quite yet. So what's stopping them going from thinking about it to doing and delivering on their intentions? And the report also makes recommendations on how organisations who communicate with the wider public can communicate with the public around climate change. So our research found that people are more aware of climate change and the need to act, which is great. It's a great start that people are more conscious of it. It's very much in their minds. So I suppose a large part of the work has been done. It's in their thinking. Great. But the understanding of the science behind climate change and exactly what can be done is still extremely limited. And also things like terminology is still mostly unknown or not fully understood. So things like carbon emissions, net zero, carbon neutral, we talk in a language that the consumers just don't really understand. And that doesn't help encourage them to move from intentions to actions because they don't really know if they're doing the right thing. And there was also an element of understanding of the government's targets is also vague and to a large degree met with some skepticism. So people were questioning, will we really meet net zero by 2050? They were really kind of questioning if that was genuine and achievable, or was it just a headline that the government wanted to put out? And we found that over 3/4 of people within the research think it is the responsibility of government and business to get the country to net zero. So a large part of society don't really see it as their role or that they have a role to play, but they think it is government's job or big businesses' job to get that net zero target. And just under half, around 44%, were unsure of what their individual actions could be that would help them to tackle climate change. So there's a big job to do to educate society around what things that they can do around their daily lives, in their homes, in their workplaces, going about their business that they can do to help tackle climate change. We also looked at what the motivators and barriers were, and what we found very clearly was that cost saving was the biggest motivator for people to take action. But we also found there was a minority of people being motivated by feeling tech savvy or green, being part of this movement around helping to fight climate change. But that was to a lesser degree. But there were some people who did take climate actions because it made them feel good. They made them feel part of a growing gang of people that are out there. But we also looked at the barriers, and one of the biggest barriers was disposable income and what they were able to spend money on that achieved net zero. So as well as disposable income, there was age and property type were also found to be significant influencers as to whether people could or were able to take action. But being a customer in vulnerable circumstances was not a barrier in itself. For example, being elderly or living with a disability or a health condition. So we don't want to kind of make broad assumptions that somebody who's older or somebody who was less able to understand net zero was not able to take part in the movement towards net zero. They were just as able. It wasn't a barrier in itself. So on the back of that, we've created a communications checklist, which is available on our website, smartenergygb.org. And that checklist can be used by any organization that is able to or looking to communicate with the public about climate change and the actions they can take at home. And that checklist helps you sense check some of your actions to make sure you're not using language that they don't understand, or that you're not talking about things that the general public are unable to comprehend, and then dismiss taking action because it's just something that seems too big for them to do. And it was also very positive, just very finally, to see the government in the last week recognising the importance of public awareness and communication in the recent net zero and heat and building strategy. However, there's a real urgency. Time is not really on our side. And this is something which needs to be addressed really urgently if our efforts to reach net zero are to be successful.
Thank you, Iagan. Over to Bridget.
Thanks very much. A lot of what I'm going to say chimes really closely with what Iagan's just said. At Ipsos MORI, we're obviously very lucky to have a lot of long-term and frequent data about public perceptions of climate change. We've been tracking it over many years, and I'm sure you won't be surprised to know we've been quite busy on it over the last few months. But certainly looking back over the past few years, we've seen issues related to the environment and climate change moving up the ranking. And it's now seen as one of the top 5 most important issues Britain's facing. So that's alongside the economy, Brexit, the NHS, and the COVID pandemic. So we did a poll earlier this month, and in that, a quarter of British adults said, without any prompting at all, that the environment was one of the most important issues facing Britain today. 1 in 10 said it was the single most important issue. And I think there's become a realisation that the environment isn't now a niche issue. It's linked to the economy and health and every other part of our lives. And even in the face of the COVID pandemic, perception of the environment as important hasn't waned. So in previous years, we've seen numbers rising and falling quite sharply around things like extreme weather events, but they have been rising consistently since mid-2019. Concern for the environment hit the highest level ever in August this year. And while we've seen a few wobbles up and down, the direction of travel is definitely consistent and upwards. I think the other important thing to mention is when we were looking at this a few years ago, it seemed to be quite a kind of young metropolitan left-wing view, but now it's become much more mainstream. We're seeing much fewer marked differences by age or gender or party support. There are still some significant differences by region and socioeconomic status, but it is much more in the mainstream. We're seeing high levels of worry about climate change. So we had 45% of adults telling us in polling in August that they were worried about climate change, including 19% who were extremely worried. And we do tend to look at personal worry about climate change. It's a really good predictor of current and intended future individual level behaviour change. There is definite acceptance amongst the UK public that time horizons are drawing closer. Just under 7 in 10 told us last month that they think we're already feeling the effects of climate change. And a lot of publicity. At the same time, we're seeing high levels of awareness of the target of reaching net zero by 2050. So in August, again, it was almost 8 in 10 UK adults were aware of that target. And over half, 54%, thought the public should achieve net zero sooner than 2050. So we're seeing high levels of awareness of climate change and a sense of urgency, we should be doing something about it. But what we're not seeing, and again, this kind of goes with what Iagan was saying, is a kind of awareness of the extent of transformation that's needed in society for us to hit net zero. So we only had around a third of British adults in a survey we ran for the Global Commons Alliance in April, recognising the need for major societal transformation for us to hit net zero. This was looking across the whole economy, including energy generation, food production, transport, and how we produce and price goods and services. And when we're looking on a more kind of personal level, there's also low levels of awareness of what the public can do themselves in the fight against climate change. So we only had 13% in our August polling saying that they know a lot about what they personally would need to do to reduce the UK's carbon emissions. And I think what we're seeing here is that over and above a kind of generic understanding, like we need to do something about transport or more established things like recycling or reducing waste, there are very low levels of awareness of the types of changes that need to be made. The other thing that I think is important is that there's a fundamental lack of understanding of the carbon saving impacts of any behaviour change. So we did some polling in April this year, and that showed on average that the public greatly overestimate the impact of some of the things they're already doing, like recycling and steering clear of plastic packaging and reusing bags and things like that. And they massively underestimate the impact of things that would make a greater difference. And some of these are quite difficult decisions, like choices on family size, or whether you have a car, or whether you have a pet. And these perceptions really haven't changed much over time. So we asked very similar questions in 2014. Nothing's changed much in the time period. So I think taken together, it suggests that there's a need for transparent feedback to the public on what needs to be done, when, and what the impacts might be. So we're currently seeing a lot of people on surveys saying that they feel they're doing all they can to combat climate change. It's about 56% we saw in a survey just last month. But qualitative work, including deliberative work through things like climate assemblies, indicate that a large part of this may be because they're just not being given clear, consistent and actionable messaging on what they could and should do. So just in summary then, I think what we've learned that we think is worthwhile going forward is that climate change, net zero and the environment are now mainstream issues. They're very topical and they're very salient. We've seen a strong level of public support for the UK's target of achieving net zero by 2050, or actually even before, but not very high levels of understanding of precisely what this will mean, and a need for realistic conversations about the extent and nature of transformation that's needed. And we've got a UK public that feels it's doing its bit, or certainly as much as it's being told to, but who really want further conversations about the topic and some clear, consistent communications about the next things we want them to take.
Thanks so much, Bridget. I have to say, I was really looking forward to this panel when I saw it was included in our COP26 Summit, because I think one of the huge gaps at the moment in this pathway to net zero is the government strategy and its plan, and then bringing the public along, which is what we're focusing on here today. And there's so much to dig into with all of your opening comments. We're already getting questions through Spectator TV. Just a reminder, if you're watching from the office or at home, you can submit a question through Spectator TV. They're all funneled to me, and I'll try to put as many to our panel as possible. But given my excitement, I am going to abuse my position as chair and ask a few questions directly before we get to the audience questions. Rory, I'm fascinated by this idea that you've put forward before, saying that actually labeling things environmentally friendly can be counterproductive, as people can often assume it means lower quality. What is the psychology behind that?
Well, I think there's something quite interesting, which is that in some ways, the most passionate environmental campaigners are sometimes counterproductive in their behavior. Because what they want to signal, and in some cases, of course, their job is all about environmental campaigning. And if you want to signal your commitment to a cause, you like to almost overplay the degree of self-sacrifice and hair-shirtedness required in order to be environmentally sustainable, simply because that's how you gain status points among your immediate committed peer group. But those behaviors, rather like sort of fanatical, veganism, for example, can actually be discouraging to people who are quite keen to make some movement, at least to improve things, but lack the time, money, and resources and status you have to focus on it to that extent. And so we will tend to assume when we see that washing powder is kind to the environment, that it does less of a good job at cleaning your clothes. You know, we mentally assume trade-offs. And I have argued to some manufacturers of these products that you might be better doing good by stealth. In other words, remove the harmful products, but don't make a lot of noise about it. By the way, when we see low fat advertised on food products, we automatically assume they don't taste as good. In fact, it's possible they actually don't taste as good because of a kind of placebo effect. But I think there are a few things I'd like to talk about very quickly. One of which is that they're absolutely right to mention the intention-action gap. They're absolutely right, too, to mention the fact that actually we're being blinded by the headlights because everybody's trying to get us to do everything simultaneously. And what we're trying to do is sometimes trying to save the world one behavior at a time, and sometimes we're trying to save the world one brand at a time. And my argument is the way to do this behaviorally is to save the world one person at a time. And what we have to do is get experts to put together a menu of behaviors, almost a point system, where you can choose between these major and minor behaviors. But your aim would be, first of all, that poorer people would be set a lower bar than richer people for the simple reason that they're doing less harm to begin with. So if I made a commitment, don't fly every other year. Okay, well, 50% of the British population don't fly in any given year anyway. So they could already tick that box. Some behaviors can be very simple. Put your washing machine and dishwasher and tumble dryer on late at night rather than in the middle of the day when there's peak demand. So some behaviors can be very easy. But if you could get people to choose according to their circumstances from a menu of beneficial behaviors, then it would be much, much easier for people to do this rather than telling everybody they have to do everything at once. It's rather the same with dietary advice. You know, one of the great problems with health advice is it's effectively take up jogging, don't eat fat, don't eat salt, never go to McDonald's. And by the time these various sort of exhortations have been piled one on top of the other, the natural human tendency is to say, too difficult, I can't do everything, so I won't do anything. And I think we could create a menu approach. The second thing that interests me, you're probably already familiar with nudge theory, but I think there's a kind of chronological nudge, which I call what you might call a temporary shove. And I think there's certain behaviors, recycling, I think, shows evidence of this, that if you force people to do it for a short time, they'll choose to do it in perpetuity, because the adoption of the behavior creates effectively a new reality where you suddenly realize what's good about the new equilibrium and what was bad about the old equilibrium. Okay, a very simple thing. If you separate your garbage into, compost and recyclables, what you suddenly realize is you have to worry about the compostables quite quickly because they start to smell, but actually leaving a whole pile of cardboard boxes in your room doesn't really bother you over 2 weeks. And so quite often, this was true with multi-channel television. It required a huge amount of persuasion to get people to shift to it. Nobody goes back. Smart meters, very difficult to get installed. Once you've got one installed, very few people ask for them to be removed. And so I think there's also a kind of what you might call halfway house libertarianism, where you force people to try something for a short period of time, leave them free to revert to the old behavior, but at least on the basis of knowing what the new behavior is like. And there are tons and tons of behaviors like this. Mobile phones. I mean, someone shouted abuse at me in 1989 because I used a mobile phone on Oxford Street. Okay, social norms change, behaviors change. Nobody who gets a mobile phone ever reverts to not having one, or very, very few. And so I think there is, alongside the nudge approach and alongside menu design, choice architecture of behavior, I also think there's a role for the temporary shove. But it preserves basic libertarian principles, which is if it doesn't work for you, you don't have to do it in perpetuity.
Iagan, I was fascinated by Bridget's polling updates that the public often overestimate certain areas and underestimate others in terms of how effective their behavior is when it comes to combating climate change. Although it's not necessarily surprising that there's certain things that the public almost don't want to acknowledge. I mean, when you are talking about really difficult things like whether or not you have a family pet, things that are near and dear to your heart, it's almost easier to overlook that. How does the government, the private sector, how do we all go about having an honest conversation about what's really going to make a difference here? And does it feed into this, in my opinion, a fundamental problem that where the government wants to go with its net zero target has not been fully communicated to the public about what it might mean along the way?
I think it's really important that people understand what their actions mean on the environment. And it was really interesting to hear from Bridget, how people under and overestimate their various behaviours. And I'm probably as guilty as that as well. I try and use my car as little as possible. I try to take public transport as often as possible. I try and fly as if it's only essential and there's no other way of getting there. And I think I'm the best person to try and save the planet, but I could be wildly wrong. There's probably other things I'm doing in my life that I think are equally as good, but are actually not that good at all. So I think there is an issue with regards to communication, to make sure people understand the value of actions, and also so they appreciate. But also they don't devalue their own actions as well. I think there's always an issue with regards to people when they don't understand or they don't appreciate the value of what they're doing. So we often hear people saying, so what if I turn my thermostat down? So what if I wash my clothes at a lower temperature? So what if I recycle? So what if I don't take the car as often? I'm not going to save the planet. And it's also always trying to encourage them to say, but you're right, you won't individually, but collectively we will. And we all need to subscribe to this, but we all need to understand the value of our actions. And that value of your action has to be communicated very clearly, very simply, because I think, as our research showed with behavioural architects was, we use phrases like carbon neutral, net zero, energy efficiency. What do these things actually mean? They're phrases, and for a lot of people, they do mean something, but they're the people who are really involved in these industries day in, day out. Yeah. But if you're asking somebody who is just, man or woman in the street who wants to do their bit, but they're sometimes just baffled by terminology. So to keep it simple, keep it basic, but keep it clear so that people understand there's a value. I suppose it's like, as Rory was mentioning, this menu of actions. If the menu is, if you go to a restaurant, you've got a menu of actions, but you've got the cost as well. And you can have the menu of value, a menu of actions, and what the carbon value is or the net zero value is towards that, or indicatively at the very least. It helps people understand that I can't do that really big energy saving thing, but I can do 5 things up here, and collectively they add to the same value of what that big thing is. So again, I think people just need to see something more visual, clear, concise, so that they understand what the impact and the positive impact of their actions will be.
One caveat here is things that appear, people have very, very little knowledge. I mean, even highly educated people have very little knowledge of what actually consumes energy. And they don't understand that heaters are much worse than televisions. I mean, highly intelligent people. And so one thing we've got to be very careful of is behaviors that have a high symbolic value but make no difference. Because they make, I'm very skeptical about turning off your mobile phone charger when you're not charging your phone, because in the scheme of things, it's like spitting in the Pacific. It's mildly inconvenient, and it may crowd out far more valuable behaviors by deluding people into thinking they're doing their bit when really they're making no difference at all.
Bridget, we've been talking broadly about people who would like to do more to tackle climate change in their own behavior, but perhaps don't know exactly how to go about it. But what about engaging with the sizable minority? There are some estimates that it's even 1 in 4 people who simply aren't motivated to tackle climate change.
I think there's lots of ways to do it. It doesn't always have to be positive about climate change. There are many other benefits to making net zero positive behavior changes, which could be motivating to them. And if we're doing it kind of by stealth and sort of around the corner, then that's absolutely fine. We did some sort of quite interesting work through the pandemic where we asked people about the behaviours that they had changed through the pandemic. And much of it was because of lockdowns. You know, they couldn't travel as much. They were doing more local journeys on foot rather than taking public transport or cars. They were separating food waste more at home just because they were at home more. So we asked them about a big range of different things. And, you know, I mean, you don't want to say that good things come out of the pandemic, but a lot of people did change their home behaviours at a fairly micro level through that period. And a lot of them actually intended to carry on as they came out of the pandemic. But when we asked them about their reasons for doing it, the main motivations were money. So it was saving them money at a time of sort of financial instability. It's because it improved their well-being or the well-being of their family. Then it was because of the lockdowns, and then it was because of climate change. So I think that, you know, if we were just asking people to make these changes to their behaviour because of climate change, you are going to come up with certain barriers. And then there are other conversations happening about the balance of individual level behaviour change versus tech change and how that's going to get us to net zero. It all becomes very complicated. But people do really understand it's going to save you money and it's going to be better for your health and the health and well-being of your family. So if people are doing it for that reason, but we still have the same net benefit, I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Absolutely, Bridget. In our behavioural architects research, the top two, first of all, saving money. That was the biggest motivator. And the second was protecting the next generation, which ties in with protecting your family, protecting your kids, your grandkids, everybody around you. So again, there's the motivators that people want people to react to aren't necessarily what people actually react to. And I think that's where we need to listen to what the public want, rather than foist something on them, say, oh, it's just, you have to be green, you have to be tech savvy, you have to be this. Actually just give them messages, give them motivators that will actually create the climate friendly behaviors. I've heard people say, oh, it's really sad when somebody's more motivated about saving money rather than saving the planet. But my thinking, similar to Bridget, is if the cost motivator is what gets them to save the planet, so be it. We still end up with the same result, but we shouldn't all be kind of moral high ground about it.
We also have a point.
That's good.
We also have a point that behavior changes attitude. It doesn't only work in one direction.
Mm-hmm.
And if you get someone to adopt a pro-environmental behavior for the wrong reason, they will generally become environmentally better disposed as a result of behaving that way. And that's actually on page 11 of the report. And it's a very useful insight that quite often the initial spur is cost saving, but then the performance of the action causes them to appreciate the environmental contribution they're making for it and therefore continue performing the action. So sometimes you get someone over the line through cost saving, but what actually maintains the continuance of the behavior is the environmental consciousness. Having bought an electric car, I am now much more smug and more likely to lecture owners of petrol cars than I was 3 weeks ago.
I think, sorry, just kind of linked to this is also kind of changing people's defaults a little bit to sort of help them to get to that place. So, for example, you know, there's been a big kind of change to use of renewables in energy, and, you know, the public didn't drive that particularly. There may have been some attitudinal drivers and support for that policy, but, you know, they haven't seen any great changes. And people who are moving on to green tariffs, which also in some cases have cost saving and well-being saving kind of impacts, feel good about it. So I think as well as encouraging people to change their behaviour by self, there's also about changes to policy and what's happening underlying that, which enable people to carry on doing the things that they were kind of doing anyway, but also sort of reaping these environmental benefits.
Iagan, to Rory's point there, he says he's rather smug now that he has his EV, and who could blame him? One of the findings in Smart Energy's report is that the desire to be seen as tech savvy can actually be a very good motivator for some customers when it comes to going green. Is that going to work with things like heat pumps, though? I mean, they're important. It's not the sexiest topic. It doesn't necessarily make you feel as boastful as perhaps Rory is with his EV.
Actually, I do find heat pumps slightly sexy, so I'll just
come back to you on that, Rory. I'd love to hear
I appreciate that's a niche. I appreciate that's a niche opinion. Actually, the heat pump's very, very interesting because, like all remarkable technologies, it's got an element of magic to it. And even I write on technology for the Spectator, I can't quite get my head around the fact that actually it produces 5 times as much heat as the energy that it costs to run. Because when my outdoors is cold, it seems completely counterintuitive to me that you can extract heat from an exterior that is colder than your indoors. Now, of course, the way it works, if you look at temperature in degrees Kelvin, you realize there's still quite a lot of heat energy in a frozen lawn, but it takes a hell of a lot of mental gymnastics to get over that hurdle, I have to admit.
Iagan, are you as convinced that all of your customers will be as excited about heat pumps as Rory?
I watch YouTube videos about heat pumps, seriously.
I'm loving my science lesson here. This is probably more than I ever learned in school. So yeah, it's a tricky one because I think being tech savvy is a small proportion of society. And I think with something like net zero, it has to apply to everyone. So we don't want to focus too much on the tech side of things because, first of all, not everybody can afford it. But not everybody wants to adopt it and employ it because they're just not comfortable using it. So we have to appreciate that there are sections of society where tech is absolutely brilliant. And whether that's, the latest apps and controls on your phone to manage your heat and your appliances in the home via your smart meter, or whether it's something like decarbonizing heat in your home with a heat pump, whether it's ground or air. So it's kind of horses for courses, really. I think for us as an organisation, we have to communicate with the entirety of Great Britain, and that covers all social circumstances. So, I would say, like, I'm not a Rory, I'll be honest. But I'm not at the other scale. I'm probably in the mid-range of techiness, and I'm comfortable with that. But I don't want something like the smart meter rollout and the evolution of energy tech to be seen as exclusive, to be seen for those who are always at the cutting edge of technology, because you then start to lose the people who can't afford it, who aren't comfortable with it. But sometimes those who can't afford it are those who need to save the most money because of their individual circumstances. So tech is important. Things like heat pumps, we're talking about hydrogen for heat coming down the line at some point, possibly, and all these things. But we can't afford to talk too much about it and be too obsessed with it, because there are some sectors of society who just need extra support to be convinced that some of this evolution in technology is beneficial and some of it doesn't actually cost that much money at all.
Bridget, you've been involved with several government schemes intended to get people to insulate their homes or improve their energy efficiency. What were the lessons from that?
Well, firstly, like Rory, I get very excited about energy efficiency and watch YouTube videos about people insulating their homes. So, it's amazing what presses different people's buttons.
At the moment.
I think that some of the sort of main learnings are about kind of educating people as to the benefits of it. I think that people still think that there's a lot of hassle involved and that hassle isn't worthwhile, even to the point of people telling us that they're not going to get free insulation put in their loft because they can't be bothered to take all the boxes out so that somebody can go in and put the insulation in. And I don't think it's about kind of not being bothered, but I think it's about that trade-off between the immediate hassle and the longer term sort of savings. Certainly with the energy crisis that's happening at the moment, we've seen quite a few energy suppliers going out of business. There are less kind of cost beneficial tariffs available. And we're seeing a lot more in our kind of monitoring that we're doing of people now actively looking for ways that they can save on their energy bills, because they can't now look at kind of switching as a way to save money. And these conversations are coming up again. But it's about making that access easy, making sure that the sort of economic operations are in place so that people can access things quickly. There aren't big sort of surprises or supply chain issues when there are surges in demand, for example. And I don't think that people really understand all of the little things that they can do to save energy in their home as well through insulation or improving the efficiency of the heating that they have. I think finally, and it kind of also relates to electric vehicles and smart meters and everything, for a lot of the newer technologies that are coming in, aren't a lot of kind of examples or reasons to believe. So there's not a lot of talk out there of people who look like me in areas like mine, who live in houses that look like mine, that are having good experiences of heat pumps, for example. So I think there just need to be some kind of reasons to believe so that people feel that this might be an option for them. And also to bring the prices down. That's the other core thing, because they're quite expensive at the moment.
I'll give you an example with smart meters about how you might sell them. The great benefit you discover when you have a smart meter is nothing to do with the environment. It's the fact that before you leave the house, put it in the hallway. Before you leave the house, you can check you haven't left anything switched on. Now, that doesn't just reduce waste. It also reduces your paranoia about how something's going to catch fire as soon as you lock your front door.
I've been there before.
So actually, fear of your home burning down is more salient than fear of unwanted carbon emissions. So why not use it, in persuading people to adopt that technology?
So we have some questions filtering in from the audience, and Iagan, I'll go to you first. And I think this actually really sums up a lot of what we've been talking about here. Don't you think the green eco option is not always the most economic option, e.g. electric cars and heat pumps? Now, as passionate as our panel seems to be about EVs and heat pumps, let's be honest, even with that £5,000 subsidy that the government's announced for 90,000 households to upgrade their boiler, this is technology that is simply not affordable to a lot of people right now. So we can talk about the benefits that exist within tackling climate change and also for the consumer, but if you can't afford it, Iagan, you can't afford it.
That is, yeah, it's been an issue. I think it's been an issue for a long time, and it's not something that's all of a sudden appeared, because electric vehicles have typically been more expensive than a petrol or diesel powered car. So those affordability issues have always been around, and I think they're becoming more obvious now that things like electric vehicles, heat pumps, different heating systems are more in people's consciousness. So people understand a bit more of them, but are immediately or very quickly put off the idea because of the affordability. And you can talk until you're blue in the face to say, but in the long term, you'll recoup your costs because your heating costs go down, your energy costs go down. Likewise, with your electric vehicle, you're not paying for petrol and diesel, which at the moment we know is like other fuels, very, very expensive. But for many people, they're living in the here and now. They're not living in 5 or 10 years' time. They're living in the here and now, and they need to buy things now. They need to, whether it's stuff around their home or their children or their wider family, they don't have 25,000, 30,000 pounds for heat pumps or for new heating systems or for electric vehicles. So that is a barrier. And that's certainly what we found in our research was disposable income was a barrier to people making that leap. So the intention is there. They love the idea, but the ability to do it financially was quite a stumbling block for them. And that is where, we need, whether it's government coming in to try and remove some of those barriers, or will it be something that the market will eventually drive? We look back at the days of the video recorders and Rory with his brick mobile phone walking down Oxford Street, which for a lot of people at those points were way out of our reach. Yeah, but now they're very, very ubiquitous. The problem is, I don't think time is on our side for that to happen. So, if we want to get heat decarbonised and transport decarbonised, we can't wait for the market to drive it so that people can afford it. That really needs to happen quite quickly so that people can adopt the technologies that will allow them to decarbonise their heat and transport. But they need to do it quite soon rather than wait further down the line, because that might just be too late for us.
And Rory, on that point, it's very optimistic and has been proven right time and time again that the market will continue to advance and to innovate, and the cost of all this technology will go down. But in the here and now, and as Iagan mentions, for the foreseeable future, it just may not be a possibility.
Just be a bit careful. I mean, obviously, you can't do everything overnight. I mean, it's worth noting on the electric car thing, yes, it's a rich person's niche, but it's also worth noting that it's always only been a tiny minority of the population who buys cars from new, okay? And these things are new. We don't really have a fully developed second-hand market, for example. It hasn't yet permeated the rental market, but it will. My contention is that actually most people who've experienced an electric car don't go back. And so it's not one of these behaviors where you have to continually work at it. It's much closer to the mobile phone where once driven, forever smitten, to borrow an advertising line from Vauxhall 15 years ago, I think. Okay, that generally the experience of the thing creates its own converts in this case. And I accept the fact that it's a rich person's thing. Equally, rich, what do you want me to buy? Do you want me to buy a Louis Vuitton steamer trunk instead? You know, okay, I have got the money. Most technology starts with the rich. It is worth noting that technophiles can be just as off-putting to the mass population as absolutely fanatical environmental campaigners can be. That people on the extremes often actually slightly unintentionally stigmatize the behaviors they adopt. So it's something we've just got to be a little alert to. And I think understanding how what you might call the early majority and the followers will actually be persuaded to adopt this technology is not the same task as selling it to the first 10%.
Bridget, I'd be interested in the polling and the feedback on this. Do the public often feel like tackling climate change is a rich person's game, as if, you know, they're actually not included in that process? Or is it a bit more positive? Do people feel like their small changes are really having an impact?
I think there is a view that small changes are impacting, and I think everybody wants to feel that they're contributing. So, I'm very glad that that's the case, because if people were feeling, I don't think there is a strong feeling that it's somebody else's problem now, with it moving much more into the mainstream. I think the other thing that's kind of quite interesting is that positivity about this and positivity that you can make a difference also helps to drive behaviour. There's been quite a lot of sort of negative messaging and a lot of doom and gloom in a lot of the things that we're talking about. And clearly that's needed to get people to take notice to start with. But I think that there is definitely a balance to be struck between it's so terrible I can't do anything about it and the little things that I'm doing can at least help me to start. So I'm just looking on this screen. We did some polling in 2019 looking at that. We had 62% thinking that if they had hope that they could reduce climate change, they would be more likely to do more about it. So I think that we do need to tell people that there is hope, that they personally can make a difference, even through the little things, and build up from that. So whatever your financial circumstances, whatever your family circumstances, and whatever lifestyle you're leading at the moment, there are things that you can do to contribute, and taken together, we can all contribute together.
We have a reminder very quickly to those watching from the office and at home, your last opportunity to submit questions through the question box on Spectator TV. They're funneled directly to me. We have a few more to get through that I already have, but last opportunity to submit. Rory, over to you.
We have a rather nice case study in the last 2 years of the efficacy of the temporary collective simultaneous shove, which is the adoption of video conferencing, which EY, large consulting firm, has banned all business travel for trips of one night or less, all flights, okay? That would have been impossible 3 years ago because the norms were different. And I think we would have adopted this technology otherwise, but it would have taken 10 or 15 years to do so. And so that's an example where actually suddenly enforcing a behavior for a short period of time can prove remarkably sticky in the longer term.
We have another question through from Jim Clark about language. He is mentioning Frank Luntz here, who is the American pollster who often does the focus groups before and after a presidential or primary debate in the States. He's been spending some time in the UK at the Centre for Policy Studies. And he has recently given the advice that we should stop talking about green and instead just focus on the benefits, safer, cleaner, as opposed to greener. The panel's thoughts. Rory, start with you.
Someone wrote to me making exactly this point. Ironically, they wrote to me from an oil rig in the South China Seas, but there we go. And they made the point that actually certain messages, for example, carbon isn't something that particularly motivates us. It's invisible, odorless, and we don't perceive it in any shape or form. Whereas cleaner air, or for example, things like rewilding, may appeal to people because they actually convey a benefit. And so I completely agree that I don't think we've got the language right in lots and lots of ways. I mean, carbon neutral is actually, if you think about it, a slightly unambitious frame. We should be looking for activities to be carbon positive as well. And so neutrality, once you've used the word carbon neutral, you have, without even being aware of it, you've set yourself a slightly too low bar in many cases.
Iagan?
Absolutely. I think language is super important in all of this. Certainly in our work with regards to the smart meter rollout, we have to take something that's quite technical but distill it down to the point where people can understand the benefits around the benefits of adopting the technology. But equally, we're probably guilty in some of the language that, but we need that language to evolve so it is becoming more simplified, understandable and relatable. So certainly the Behavioural Architects report that we did, as I mentioned earlier, carbon emissions, net zero, carbon neutral, didn't resonate with them because people couldn't visualize what does that mean. But it needs to be a shift to the language of being more positive, more relatable, and to Bridget's point around, the language has to be positive as well, and people understanding that their actions are making positive changes. Sometimes we're presented with an Armageddon kind of doomsday scenario in some of the discussions around climate change. And then people think, well, is it too late? Or again, will my little actions make any difference at all? So why should I bother? Because it sounds as if it's game over. But it's changing that language to being a bit more inspirational, a bit more motivational, and really encouraging people to understand and never devalue their actions, as little as they think they might be, but never devalue them. But it is really, really changing that narrative around to being uplifting, inspiring, rather than doomsday.
Bridget?
I think there's a really great example, the Earthshot Prize that was on, it's been running for about 9 months. It was on TV last week. And that has purposefully taken a very kind of positive, less kind of doom and gloom approach. And I think that's a really good way to move in the future. It also focuses a lot on some of the benefits of reducing sort of carbon emissions and taking climate action, on things like protecting and restoring nature and improving people's lived environments. And I think I definitely agree, talking about the benefits to an individual and to their lives as a whole, it is a really positive step to take.
We have a few minutes left. One of the questions that's come through reads, the government is focused so much on the policy and not enough on the psychology. What are the easy wins here? Iagan, let's start with you.
How long have you got?
Are there no easy wins? Is that the reason we're not so focused on psychology?
Well, I think the psychology is becoming more and more part of it, which is really, really encouraging. If you hear what Bridget was saying there, that's exactly the way people are thinking and how they react to things. Rory's experience of engaging and messaging, and ours with regards to the smart meter rollout. There's lots of information out there as to what stimulates, what motivates individuals to do something, and not just do it as a one-off, but do it as a learned behavior or a behavior change. And whether it is that thing that pushes you down a certain way, but it then becomes the norm for your life. Obviously policy is important because it gives us the direction of travel, and it gives us the intention by the policymakers and the government. But I think a deeper understanding of what makes a consumer tick, and we're not homogenous. We all have different things that tick our boxes. So again, understanding what works for one section of society, and what worked for me. Even today, Rory is super excited about his heat pump. I might be a late adopter to that. But that's probably given the type of property I'm in. But there's different things that tick different people's boxes, and that's what I think the psychology of the whole messaging around the environmental and the journey towards net zero is super important. By understanding what makes people tick will really help the government communicate that message and make sure that the message is understood across society rather than just for the energy savvy or the tech savvy, because they're probably ahead of the game anyway. It's the people who don't understand or who need to understand what role they can play in all of this is but that language has to be simple, but it has to be appropriate and relatable to that particular group as well. But that's where the psychology and understanding, again, what makes that consumer tick.
Rory, one of the criticisms of the government so far is that it hasn't really been thinking about the consumer. And we've actually seen in recent weeks Boris Johnson pivot slightly, acknowledging more that there have been concerns about the cost of all this, what it will actually mean for your day-to-day life. And now the Prime Minister is insisting that this isn't going to come in through force. You're not going to be told you have to rip out your gas boiler. You're not going to be told that you can no longer buy meat products. The government's going to take a slowly approach to winning the public over. So again, are there easy solutions to that negotiation, finding that sweet spot? Or is the problem that the government has just put policy so far forward of the psychology, perhaps if it had done this in reverse, the public would already be ready and willing to sign up to some more of these difficult topics?
One of the problems with government is that it is a government. Okay, I'm a very big fan of that, can it? I'm a very big fan of a book by James C. Scott called Seeing Like a State, which is, and he's an anarchist anthropologist, but strangely writes a book which is almost a defense of Burkean conservatism. Very strange book. But the tendency to see things in average terms, and also the tendency to do legislation first, economics second, and persuasion third, strikes me as a fundamental mistake. I'm not suggesting for a second, even as an advertising executive, that this entire problem can be solved purely through voluntary individual action. But I think we should look at what progress we can make voluntarily first, bring in economic incentives second, where those fail, and then only resort to compulsion as a last resort. Now, of course, government consists of a lot of lawyers who occasionally take advice from economists and never talk to advertising executives. And so they tend to approach everything from the opposite direction. Now, I'm not saying my direction's right. I'm simply saying there's an inherent bias in the way that a legalistic authority looking at essentially the average representative consumer, there's a limit to how many problems they can solve. Because the number of problems you can solve by imposing the same rules on everybody, regardless of their individual circumstances, whether it be financial or the house they live in. I'll give you an example. Okay, Caroline Lucas, head of the Green Party, flies to New York once a year. Okay, she gets a lot of flack for that. Her son lives in New York. What's she expected to do? Not see her son? It's ridiculous. Okay, everybody has different circumstances. And the great thing about persuasion is if you've got a good reason, you can ignore it and do something else instead. The problem with legislation is it's a very, very blunt implement. And so there is a lot you can achieve through voluntary action, which is impossible to achieve through forced coercion or imposition, at least in the kind of state which we wish to inhabit, which is not completely totalitarian.
Bridget, one of the lessons that some people are pushing around the COVID crisis is that it turns out, surprisingly, if you tell the public to do something, they will comply. But that does seem to be breaking down when it comes to the green agenda. There doesn't seem to be this confidence that, as Rory says, if you just try to force this on people or legislate, that it will necessarily go so well. Do you get the sense from your polling that voluntary measures are going to be more popular on this pathway than those that are legally binding?
I think that carrots always go down better than sticks, and encouraging people to come along with you will always have a better outcome than enforcing things on them. That's just kind of human nature. And we found that in polling as well, when we asked people who had changed their behaviour what would encourage them to continue with those sort of positive behaviour changes that they'd made. And it was about things like incentives and putting the infrastructure in place to make it easy for them to carry on doing that. And I think that for any behaviour change, it's very much about kind of the policy and the psychology working together. So using the psychology in policy design, but also optimising the policy to work with the humans within it. And that's just the basics of how things really should work. Behind the scenes. Can I read a nice little quote from a lady who I spoke to about this? She said, what everyone's learned, this is from the pandemic, is how the impossible can be possible and how adaptable people can be. It's really shown that we can make drastic changes to our lives if we have to or if we're told to. And I think that's encouraging. Before, the government might have shied away from policies they thought people would refuse because they possibly would not go in their cars or they wouldn't possibly not fly. But it's shown that people can and will, and they should learn and take heart from that, definitely.
Well, I'm very sorry to say that we are out of time because this has been a fascinating discussion. I want to thank Iagan, Bridget, and Rory for joining me here on Spectator TV. A big thanks to Smart Energy for making this panel possible. And a huge thank you to those in the office and at home who have decided to join us and for submitting your questions. I'd encourage you to head back over to Spectator TV, click on the next link, and watch our final panel, Tips for Living Green. For now, thank you and have a great afternoon.